My mother took me to great Russian pedagogue Yuri Yankelevich. I was 5 years old, and he suggested that he'd give me to one of his assistants for 6 months and then see if it's really worth it. My mother had a choice. He said, what assistant would you like him to go? A kind one or a stern one? And of course she chose the stern one. And then Yuri Isayevich Yankelevich listened to me. And then he said to my mom, I'm taking him. My name is Dmitry Sitkovetsky. I'm a violinist and conductor, and this is Keeping the Flame, a series about how family, politics, and great art shape a life, but never determine its destiny. In this episode, I will tell you what it was like to be trained as a professional violinist in the Soviet Union. It was right away very demanding, very professional approach. They would start with open strings, and they would make sure that you have a good bow arm so you could hear the sound. Then they would start working on the left hand, and for the rest of your life, you would be conditioned to play scales. Scales are like brushing your teeth. When I ask now in master classes, some of the students, I said, do you play scales? They tell me, sometimes. I said, do you brush your teeth also sometimes? Or twice a day? So, the scales, and then arpeggios, and then double stops as you grew older and more advanced. They went through all kinds of exercise. And that's where it's completely different than, let's say, Suzuki method, where they start even at 2. At first was just the Japanese students, but now it's all over the world. They start playing. They make it into a game. There was not much of a game from that Soviet system. In Russia, professional musician was certainly not a job, much more than a profession. It was a calling. We were ordained like priests to be musicians, which required sacrifices from early on, from children's normal games and, time outside and playing and everything. No, you had to stay home and practice. I was pretty quick for certain things, but then technical things just take time. And I was never that keen on just doing those exercises, but it had to be done. I ended up with Maya Glizarov, the assistant, who was notoriously strict, but very effective. Everybody was totally paranoid of her. She used physical punishment with her plastic comb. First, she would just comb her hair, getting very annoyed at the playing of a student, and then she would take that and hit. I don't think she ever hit me, but she hit other famous violinists. When I was really little, I would practice, and my nanny, darling, dear nanny, she heard in one of the lessons that my violin teacher, Glizarova, would say, Dima, hold the violin higher. When I would be practicing at home, and she would pass by between kitchen and whatever room I was practicing in, she would casually mention, Dima, keep the violin high. I did not particularly like that, and just whatever, it expresses my personality. And I said to my nanny, Shura, just tell me, in your village in Kalushka district, everybody holds their violin higher. So I was a bit of a smartass at that age already. Very often they would ask some of the authority figure to practice with me. My father's old friend, the concert maestro of the great radio orchestra. So he would come over for an hour. I liked him, but I didn't like anybody getting in the way of my practicing. So as soon as he ring the bell, I would go to the toilet. And I would sit there with the book for most of that hour, 45 minutes. And then I would come out and everything. So to the point where he would leave his house, which took about 45 minutes to get to my apartment. He would call me, said, Dima, I'm leaving now. Go to the toilet. So that was my way. But later on, it became a good tradition to play for older classmates, from Yankelevich. We went, of course, to a special central music school, which was based on big emphasis in music, but also all the other subjects were there. Since it was central music school, so that means it was more important than similar music schools outside of Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Baku, Tbilisi, Riga. There were many similar schools of high quality. But since everything was so centralized in Soviet Union, everybody was trying to get to Moscow because that was the road to success, to competitions and a solo career. One didn't feel that, I'm better than anybody. It's survival of the fittest. Every 6 months, we would play an exam. And then at the end of the year, it was a very important exam because some students who were not doing so well, they would be expelled. And yet, the better ones from outside would come in. There was another thing, class of Yankelevich. He would do a whole evening of only his students. So I remember I was 8 years old when I first participated, and I was always the youngest one. So I was always first. And then would be Pavel Kogan, who was 2 years older than me, since our fathers were big rivals. They would immediately start comparing Kogan Sitkovetsky. So here's Kogan Sitkovetsky again. And Pavel was much more advanced in terms of repertoire. So I had to catch up. What makes a big difference between that system and the one that I see continuously in the West, they would never let a little one approach a big concerto or a big sonata or big repertoire because you had to earn the right to approach it. You could play it privately in your practice room, but this is something it's a dream. It's an impossible dream that one day might become a reality. Finally, at the age of 15, I played for the first time with orchestra. It was a Bach concerto, A minor. I was already playing violin for 10 years. And also the choice of your fingerings, bowings, had to be absolutely the way that teacher prescribed. I remember a very interesting program on Russian television about Yankelevich, and one of the students playing for him was me. So you see me at the age of 9, quite well-fed little kid with open eyes, and I play for him a very beautiful piece by Chrysler called Prelude and Allegro in the style of Pugnani. There is a very high position going passage there, and I worked out my own fingerings. So professor looked at me and said, Dimka, where did you get those fingerings? I said, I actually made them up myself. He said, really? I said, yeah. Phew, very good. Now change to my fingerings, you'll be playing them. So he acknowledged on one hand, the invention, but still it was dismissed. The other interesting story that I heard from Dora Schwarzberg, one of my older colleagues at Yankelevich's class, I don't remember it myself, but she remembers very vividly how I played a piece by Vietang. It was called Ballade and Polonaise. And so when I came to Polonaise, Yuri Isayevich, that Yankelevich, would ask me, he said, Dimka, do you know what Polonaise is? I was quite well educated. So I said, yes, it's a dance. I said, good. What dance is that? I said, it's a Polish dance. Said, very good. Who dances Polonaise? I said, Polish knights. I said, very good. He said, can you play like a knight? I said, I think I can. And all of a sudden I changed my posture. I looked different, even though I was quite short still at that time. And this theme, the lyrical theme, she said, you have to play with love. Can you play with love? I said, yes, I think I can. I mean, I was, again, 9, maybe 10 years old at that point. So that was the system. I remember Professor Yankelevich had something akin to 5-year plan. He had a repertoire plan for each of his students, or certainly each of his outstanding or promising students. And then, as you grow older, said you should go to this competition and you should go to that competition. And so he was very, very organized. You know, Yankelevich at some point was the teacher of 30 different winners of international competition. That's quite something. So once he would put forward from the violin department his students, they would be competing now within the Moscow Conservatory against the others. And then the best ones would be chosen to go to all Russian competition, then to all Soviet competition. So by the time you were selected to actually go abroad, already you've passed through several auditions. So no wonder when they came to the international competition, they just annihilated all the foreigners because they were incredibly well prepared. They trained you like an athlete. You represented not just yourself and your teacher, you represented Soviet Union. You were playing for the glory of the workers' paradise or whatever. And Stalin, he figured out that with his great geniuses and great performers, he could conquer the world a lot more impressive than with his army. That was a very smart thing that the Soviets inherited from the Tsar system. The reason so many Jews played the violin, especially violin, but also sometimes piano and cello, it comes from very few options that the Jews in the Tsarist time had in order to become anyone. They could either, change money, be doctors sometimes, and musicians. That was allowed. That's why they excelled. And it's very interesting that the famous Russian school, so-called Russian violin school, consists mostly of Ukrainian Jews. My first trip outside of Russia was when I was 12 years old. It was, in a way, a trip to Prague to receive the first prize for this radio competition. Concertino Prague was radio competition. So the way it worked, that we all made recordings in our countries, in our cities. I made a recording in Moscow with my mother playing piano, and it was sent to Prague. And then the jury anonymously listened to all these recordings, and then they decided who will be the winner, and then they realized that's this one, and that was Dmitry Sitkovetsky first prize. Well, but the interesting part was also the announcement, the telegram from Prague, because in those days you couldn't just look up on your phone. You had to be informed that what prize you got or whether you got any prize. It was birthday party, my 12th birthday party in the apartment, and everybody that was in the apartment was with me was Ksana Knorr, my close friend Yura Rozum, Nina Kogan, Kolya Kondrashin, and so forth. All my classmates were there, and all of a sudden the door rang. It was early evening probably, or late afternoon, whenever we got together, and there was the postman, and he brought the telegram from Prague. And it read that Dmitry Sitkovetsky got the first prize in Concertino Prague. It was such big news. Of course, couldn't have been a better birthday present to me. But what was interesting, if I had a camera at that time, or somebody would have a hidden camera, just to see the reaction of my friends and classmates who were all competing with me one way or the other, and all of a sudden I became a celebrity right in front of their eyes. So that was, and that would have been a perfect, episode for a film. How, at the age of 12, how some were happy for me and some were not so happy or pretended to be happy. That's a human reaction. Then the winners were invited for 1 week in Prague. And my mother went there not only to play for me, but she was also the adult looking after me. Of course, we went to the National Opera Theater to hear Rusalka by Dvorak. Also, we went to hear jazz for the first time, Ray Charles. I'd never heard Ray Charles until I came to Prague. They introduced, of course, to the Academy of Music, and they showed us Prague. I loved that whole thing. It was almost intoxicating. Also different food, different language for the first time. Prague in 1966, that was the Prague Spring feeling. It felt almost like the West, because that was the time when it was less than 2 years before the Russian tanks would come in 68, and there was a feeling of great freedom. Compared to Russia, it was always physical sensation. So there was very, very big impression. Back to Russia, I felt physically the pressure. The air became heavy, and when I went back, because of all that, suspicion and pressure. And I realized early on that all the Soviet artists, without exception, they were glorified slaves of the regime, whether they like that term or not, because you become part of that system, which both supports you, it gives you privileges, it gives you better apartments, you can have your own car, you can have your dacha, you can have your, higher salary and everything, but they own you. That's all for this chapter. I'm Dmitry Sitkovetsky, and you've been listening to Keeping the Flame, produced by Libo Libo Studio. Next time, I will tell you what it was really like to grow up in the Soviet system, how we found our way around it, from chasing forbidden books to figuring out which classmates might be snitches, and how I ended up hating it so much that I left it behind for good.